Welcome to Story 516, a podcast where we sit down with Christians and talk about how God is showing up in the world today. I'm your host, Zach, and joining me today is Jared Purdin. We got to talk about psychology, personalities, and how God's creative hand is at work in those areas. Let's listen in. I am joined today by a good friend of mine, Jared. Jared, would you care to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jared Purdin. I've been a friend of Zach's for quite a while. We both met in college together, and right away we didn't necessarily get to know each other super well, but over time we realized we had a lot of similar interests. We both met in kind of a lot of different campus ministry settings, and so that's how we got to know each other. But been married for a bit and living in the same area as Zach.
I know you studied psychology and have consistently been interested in those topics and done research, reading, listened to other podcasts about those topics. What first brought you to that field? What first interested you in psychology?
I feel like what happened with a lot of millennials, and probably people who are younger too, to be honest, but I think a lot of people who are millennials got into psychology for kind of the same reason that you go onto like WebMD to find out why you're feeling sick, in the sense that I think a lot of people went into it to kind of self-diagnose themselves, whether they had certain experiences in the past or they just wanted to better understand themselves and other people around them. I think that's probably what led me to wanting to know that. I had always been very interested in why people do what they do and kind of what motivates people to do certain actions. And so that's the primary reason that I got into that field of psychology. Kind of when I dove into it, though, there's a lot of different fields. You can go the more behavioralist route where you're kind of more about just people's actions and studying that, or you can go to the more Freudian route, which is kind of more psychoanalysis and dealing with the subconscious. I definitely was very interested in a Jungian route, which Jordan Peterson has made very popular now, if you know who that is, but which is kind of studying archetypes throughout history and stories, throughout all different cultures and civilizations. Also just fascinated with personality and psychology as well.
In your field of study, did you find yourself seeing threads of truth, these little threads that kind of pulled you back to the Bible or to what God has created?
Yeah, it's interesting first and foremost with the word psychology. So if you break that word down, psyche and ology, most people know ology means study of. But psyche, we think a lot of times of psyche as like your mental state. But actually in the Greek, psyche literally means spirit. So the word psychology literally means the study of the spirit. So it is interesting because when most of us think about psychology now, we think about it in more like empirical or like materialistic means as much as you can, in the sense like, chemical imbalances, certain taking certain drugs to help with certain mental illnesses. And that is all definitely an aspect of it for sure. But there is an aspect of psychology when it deals with consciousness that certainly delves a lot into the spiritual. Getting to kind of your first question about that, I would say the more that I've looked into psychology, the more I kind of find the awe and the wonder of the creation of humans as kind of fascinating. God created everything in the universe, if you're a believer as I am. And I do think that the most fascinating thing in the universe he created was man. I've always found that to be true, especially again with how we think as human beings. And so it is certainly the case that modern psychology has a very secular bent, in the sense that Freud certainly was no believer in God, and many of the prominent psychologists that you study once you go into just undergrad, really a lot of those don't have anything to do with like distinctly talking about deities or God or anything like that in that sense. But it is certainly the case that a lot of psychology overlaps with a lot of what you learn in the Bible. Like a very basic type of thing, a very basic example when it comes to this is something called like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is maybe the only truly effective therapy. Other therapies can work, but from what I've read, it's really the only one that's been proven to be very effective. And that one is simply not even changing the way you think. It's more so getting you to do things and that changes the way you think. So instead of, diving into what you do and why you do, instead just picking up good behaviors and doing those, and that changing the way you think about those. You can kind of relate that to rituals that the Jews were told to do in the Old Testament, and then even in the New Testament when it comes to certain ways in which Jesus was asking his disciples to act. You can see that like the very act of doing some of those things actually changes your whole mindset.
I mean, that reminds me of the book of James, where it's like, show me your faith by what you do. So in the book of James, they're inescapably interlinking faith and action, faith in our works, which is really interesting to think about.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big pull and tug in the New Testament for sure. That tug between like, you are saved by grace, not by anything you've done, but also in the book of James, it talks about the idea of like, but if you're not bearing fruit, then are you following a true religion, right? Like, and so that's a very fascinating thing that the Bible talks about for sure. So there's always that interplay between action and thought.
So when you were doing your undergrad, and I guess even since then, do you see the secular world acknowledging faith? Do people view it as an important part of life?
That's a good question. I think that it used to be the case, at least I remember this being the case when I was in college, in undergrad, in like the late 2000s, basically, before the 2010s. But what was definitely the case online is that the new atheist movement was very prominent at that point, basically saying like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens and the like, basically just talking about how religion was all just rubbish and essentially that there was no real value to it. But it definitely does seem as if pop culture anyways, and pop psychology to a certain degree, has definitely changed its tune on that a bit. I will say for sure that it has always been the case. Anytime I've looked into it, they'll talk about the happiest people on earth, because obviously we as humans are always obsessed with being happy because we think that's the number one goal in life. And so many times they'll look at various factors that lead to people being very happy. Well, one of those factors that is true is that people who are religious are happier than people who are not. And so, again, if somebody who doesn't believe can say, well, that's because, they're believing a delusion, or as Marx said, it's the opiate of the masses, so they're on God drugs or something like that, right? Even if that's the case, as I kind of said before, like if you are somebody who doesn't believe in God, but you understand that there's actually a benefit for your happiness to believe in God, well, then maybe you ought to at least try. Or maybe you ought to at least look at it from a mental health standpoint and say there's something there that I don't know, and maybe I ought to. And this kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier with pop psychology. It kind of was in the 2000s popular to say religion bad, right? Faith bad. But it's definitely been the case more where people at least are acknowledging that there seems to be a utility to it. Now, as a believer, I think it's just true. But if there's also utility, that's fine as well. And I've heard stories of many different individuals who have actually come to become believers in God because they first were searching and looking for religion because they had heard that people who have that are more happy.
So that's almost like the very nature of what God built into our psyches or psychology has led to the study of psychology, which then led to them realizing, oh, if you're religious, you maybe have a better chance of being happy, which then led people to be like, oh, I want to be happy, so I'm going to seek out and study and examine religion, which leads people to Christ. So it's interesting. At myself, I'm really big into stories and just seeing kind of the foreshadowing, the little threads of truth, the hidden nuggets that God has maybe just implanted in all these different disciplines. So I know earlier you mentioned happiness. That's been a topic that I know has come up in the church and in Christianity, kind of the difference between happiness and joy. Curious what your perspective on that is.
Yeah, my perspective is that they are totally different things. Or I should say we should view them in different realms of thought. I tend to think that it's better to kind of view happiness as just an emotion. It's kind of like a temporary state of being. Like you are happy because you won a game. You are happy because you're eating ice cream, right? Those are all things that make you happy. Generally speaking, those things are associated with, neurochemicals in the brain that get fed to your brain that also are going to motivate you to be happy and have those feelings. Happiness is, in the right place at the right time, a good thing, obviously. The big mistake that we have made in our culture, I believe, is that we have replaced happiness with what joy ought to be. We've basically said that happiness is the ultimate goal. There's a philosophical experiment, and I can't remember quite what the name of it is, but I think it might just be called the hedonism box. And hedonism, for those who don't know, basically just means those who are constantly seeking pleasure. And so it is this idea that if you were to be able to be, placed in this altered state of reality, whatever it is, where you could have all your needs met and, all the chemicals are flashing, so you're feeling happy and you're constantly getting what you want. And there's no downsides either. Ice cream usually leads to being fat, right? If you eat too much of it. Or if you have too much of a good thing, the world and its consequences usually slowly catch up with you somehow. In this philosophical experiment, the idea is like nothing. You don't get any of those bad things associated with it. It's all good and happiness, right? And so the question is like, is that the ultimate purpose for being? Is that the ultimate reason to exist? And I actually think that many Christians make the incorrect assumption of thinking that's what heaven is. And I don't think that bears out biblically at all. Happiness is good and fine in its place, but joy, from my perspective and from how I understand it, is more of a state of being. The best example of that is Jesus on the cross, right? It's Jesus choosing to bear the cross that he has been given. It's Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, crying to God, saying, if this cup can be taken from me, do so, but at the end of the day, your will be done, right? And he's going through just a complete bevy of emotions. But at the end of the day, we say that Jesus has joy, and we say he has joy because he chooses to bear his cross. He chooses to go through the pain and suffering that he does. And so I believe that Christians are called to be joyful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all Christians have to be happy all the time.
That's interesting because you usually don't hear the idea of being joyful and suffering necessarily in the same breath most of the time. Mm-hmm. Most of the time it's like, I need to eliminate suffering so I can be happy, so I can be joyful. There are those examples of the extreme examples of missionaries or people who refuse to deny their faith in the face of suffering. Are there good examples of facing that suffering, picking up that cross, but still having joy for those of us who maybe aren't faced with being killed for saying that we believe in Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, every single person has, or I should just say every single Christian has their cross to bear. And no, it's not going to be the case that every single person is called to die and be a martyr. But everybody deals with different particular issues in their time. Paul talks about a thorn in his side. We don't know what that is. It's likely the case that it wasn't literal. Otherwise, why didn't he remove it? So right. He's likely speaking of something that bothered him. In the movie Paul the Apostle, they kind of just play with this idea that thorn in his side was actually the guilt he dealt with doling out punishment to Christians before he was a Christian. So the people that he killed or put to death and persecuted, essentially, which is very fascinating. That takes it into the psychological realm, and it takes it to a place where obviously the movie is playing with that idea. We don't have any reason to fully believe that is the case, but it's possible. And if it is definitely something psychologically that Paul was dealing with. Paul being a person who he knew he was forgiven, but even when we as human beings know we're forgiven, we still have, that emotional baggage that we have to deal with. We still have that memory in the past that we have to somehow take and redeem to actually take that pain and make it into something beautiful, right?
Do you find yourself as someone who has studied psychology, psychoanalyzing all your friends all the time?
Actually, yeah, kind of, in a sense. Not in a sense that I am constantly diagnosing people with mental disorders, but more so I kind of have always had an interest, like I said before, of understanding why people do what they do and how they do it. And what drives people ultimately at the end of the day. There's a lot of different personality tests out there. The one that is taken seriously for people who study personality in psychology is called the Big Five. The Big Five basically consist of 5 factors: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So how that one works is it puts you on a scale from 0 to 100 to determine like how open you are, or how agreeable, or how neurotic. And for the most part, all of those factors are, very neutral. High in openness can be good in some situations, and it can be bad in some situations. It could be good for your ability to be able to learn something new, like a new language, but it can be bad if you're in an environment where you really want to stay away from diseases, because people who are high in openness are more likely to say, well, I'm going to explore and try out these new things, but then you put yourself more in danger, right? Especially in certain situations. So that's kind of how that works. There are plenty of different personality tests, I'm sure everybody knows, but I do tend to stick to that one. And yeah, so it is definitely the case that with people I've known, I start to kind of think sometimes, I'm like, oh, I've gotten to know this person pretty well. Oh yeah, they're a person who's willing to just talk with everybody and go out whenever they want. And they never seem like they want to stay at home. Yeah, they're probably extroverted, but then you meet another person and you're like, oh, this person is extremely orderly. You have to be on time with them. If you're even a minute late, they kind of start to worry. That person's probably high in conscientiousness, at least in terms of the orderliness of conscientiousness anyways. So yeah, I do find that interesting.
Do you ever find yourself thinking when you're reading the Bible, if the character you're reading about, like where they scored on some of these traits?
Yeah, I have definitely thought about that before. Now, first and foremost, I haven't done any advanced method to figure this out. It's more just me reading it and speculating, to be honest. I just, for the record, what I'm about to say is in no way, shape, or form the absolute truth. This is just my speculation. But yeah, I will say this. When reading the person of Jesus, it's extremely hard to know, so I haven't even tried that. Which I feel like you could maybe say high in openness in some ways, but otherwise I feel like it's very difficult for me to say about the person of Jesus. When it comes to the person of Peter seems to be a person who's very much so like a go-getter. He's the person who he's told something, he's fiery about it, and he acts, right? He just instantly goes for it. I mean, he does seem to me, he's also somebody who's willing to go against the grain when it comes to that type of thing and doesn't seem to care as much what society or other people say of him. That being said, that makes me and pushes me to believe that Peter probably had some level of low agreeableness, in the sense that he was very much so just willing to do what he thought was right and then just went for it.
Right.
And that's something that every Christian obviously needs to have. But, for people who are lower in agreeableness, that's easier to do. And for people who are higher in agreeableness, that's harder. Versus, another situation where you're at the church and everybody needs to get along so you guys can push forward for some fundraiser, right? And maybe you don't like exactly how the fundraiser is being done, but the truth is, at the end of the day, it's better to do it than to disagree about the little things. In that case, high in agreeableness would be an advantage, right? And the people who are more disagreeable need to learn to be a little agreeable sometimes. But yeah, there are a lot of different individuals within the Bible who I've thought about that and thought about maybe specific traits they had. Moses, I was just thinking about this. I was talking to my wife about this, but I'm sure Moses was probably very low in extroversion, or at least seems that way, with how much he didn't want to speak in front of people. He also seems to go off by himself in a lot of instances, and he has his brother speak for him. So it seems like that was probably the case with him. But yeah, I've thought about that with a decent amount of the biblical characters.
I know there was I think it was like a whole semester or a period of time when we were growing up through college, maybe a little after college, where a ton of people just got super interested in personality tests and analyzing each other and figuring out what's my personality, what's my Myers-Briggs, what's my Enneagram, where do I rank on the Big Five. If someone came up to you and had a question about how much weight they should put on these personality tests to understand themselves versus just looking exclusively to the Bible to understand themselves, how do we balance kind of secular science versus just pure religion. Because I think there is that, oftentimes there's that separation in our minds, at least, of one's religious, one is science, and they're not supposed to mix for some reason. I personally disagree with that. I think they do mix, but I'm curious to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I think that I believe God likes and thoroughly enjoys diversity of personality, diversity of different takes, how do people do different things. It seems to me evident that personality was not the case, or it wasn't something that happened because of the fall, but it was something I think that is built into the system. It's something that I believe God wished and desired for humans to be. You know, it's the idea that you're going to have multiple problems within a society, multiple problems within a civilization, and ideally, if everybody was working together by having their own different perspectives and their own personality that they can bring into a situation, you'd be able to hopefully get together and solve those problems, right? When it comes to a lot of the different methods, you know, you have, like you said, Big Five, Enneagram, Myers-Briggs, all these other things. I view personality tests, I'm very pragmatic about it. I view them as useful as they are to the person using them, in the sense that if you take a personality test and you feel as if it helps to explain some things about you or maybe your spouse or your friends or whatever it is, and you guys are able to better communicate that way, then I think it's very useful. There is this thing that can happen, like a confirmation type bias thing with personality tests, where, you know, you can read almost every personality and find some factor that is you in it, right? And so sometimes people might read one and be like, that's me, that's totally me. But then you read another one and you're like, well, that's me too. And so people have that tendency to do that. So again, I wouldn't necessarily put like a ton of weight in terms of saying that this personality fully defines who you are, but it can be useful. For example, I'll go to myself. When I took the Big Five and then my wife took the Big Five, we found that we actually were pretty close in almost every single trait. You know, we're both higher in openness, middle of the road conscientiousness, middle of the road extroversion. She was a little higher in neuroticism than me. But the one thing that we were very different is agreeableness. And so I tend to be very disagreeable, and she tends to be very agreeable. So after going through this, you know, a light bulb kind of went off in my mind, and it made me understand something. Sometimes when we'll talk to each other, there'll be times where we disagree. And when those times happen, you know, assuming we're talking about like philosophy or theology or something, I actually get really excited. So when we disagree on something, I get excited because I think to myself, oh yeah, iron's going to sharpen iron here. You know, we're going to find the truth. We're going to talk about this. We're going to hash it out in love, and we're going to find out, you know, where the truth lies. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she's wrong. Maybe we're both wrong. I don't know, but this is exciting. We're going to find out, right? And so that was like always my attitude going into those types of situations, where my wife's attitude was usually more one of, oh no, we disagree. This isn't good. We should agree on things. We shouldn't disagree on things. If we disagree on things, that means we're not unified, right? That means that we're going to have problems in regards to this, and this is not good, so we better make sure we agree on it. So a lot of times when I got into those situations, I would want to do it. I would want to talk about that certain topic, and I'd be really excited, but she would get really frustrated and upset. And it took me doing the personality test with her to realize, oh, that is why that can happen. And so now when we get into those situations, I've had to learn to calm, you know, slow my jets a little bit, and to be more understanding, and to not treat it like it's a competition or some game, but to instead, you know, listen more and try to be more empathetic, where she's had to learn that it's okay to disagree about certain things. Like, it's okay, you know, as long as it's not something that's going to kill us both or it's catastrophic. It's okay to disagree on little things, right? So, yeah, that's been very useful.
Yeah, I can see that being really helpful in terms of even just Christianity, in understanding that when you have a disagreement, like there are so many denominations, and I'm guessing some of these maybe, I'm speculating here, but maybe certain denominations have a higher rate of people with trait openness.
I would assume so too, but I don't know for sure.
So it's good to kind of just know, even from your personal interactions with people to maybe looking at bigger or larger scale conflicts, that a lot of times it could just be we have a different trait in our personality that does tend to, without looking into it, does tend to lead to at least perceived conflict. But it doesn't necessarily have to be conflict, like in your example.
Mm-hmm. I feel like one of the best examples I can think of with that is it has to do with like the Western church versus the Eastern church, or more specifically, I'll say me and my wife have gone to like African churches within our community here. And it is definitely a case of frustration when certain people coming from a Western U.S. church have to arrange in a time with a African church. And the reason that can be such a big conflict is in the U.S., service starts at 10, it starts at 10. That's how it goes. And it's usually the case in almost every service that it's going to go, whatever, an hour to an hour and a half. Maybe if the pastor is really, really feeling it that day, it goes like an hour, 40 minutes or something.
Right.
But like that's most Western churches, right? We try to stay on time. We try to keep things the same so people know what they expect in terms of time. But African churches, like, throw those rules out the window because they might say they're starting at a certain time, but then it starts, an hour or two later. I haven't been to Africa, but I've heard missionaries and people tell me that it's even crazier when you're in Africa in terms of when things start and when they end. Church service is usually a whole day thing, and it starts whenever it starts and it ends whenever it ends, and that's just how it is. And so those ideas of time are completely different, but it's not to say that the African church is wrong or immoral because they do it that way. They just have a different view of time and how things ought to run versus the West, which is just much more, conscientious about time and wants things to be exactly where it is.
And then even taking that back to just the individual level, I know I, like you, score higher in the trait disagreeableness. I would find myself maybe more prone to debate or playing devil's advocate in conversations, especially in those formative years when I was really developing my beliefs. And I think a lot of people could look at that, and I probably even looked at myself and was like, what's wrong with me? Why am I so mean all the time or just disagreeing with everything? And that's just how I figured things out. That was exciting to me, kind of like you said. I was curious, in looking at personality types, what recommendations would you have for a Christian to avoid determinism? And what I mean by that is you might take a personality test and be like, okay, I score highly on these 3 things. This is who I am. End of story. And I can see that leading to the point of like, is this just explaining too much about us? What about grace? What about God's work in our life changing us? Can we change? Can our personalities change? And I'm speaking from my own experience and struggling with some of that determinism of like, well, this is just who I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess there's two ways to talk about this. The first is personality can and does change. You'll take a test one year and then you be a few years later, and then you will have completely changed on some aspect. One of the most classic ones is that as you get older, you tend to get lower in openness. And obviously not true for everybody, but on average, that happens to people.
And that would be the example of grandma and grandpa, or even mom and dad being like, I'm not going to learn that new tech device.
Exactly.
Why would I do that?
Yep, that would be exactly right. And that's just what tends to happen to the human body as you get older. It's just, you're like, new thing, that's tough now. I don't think I can handle that. But the second point I was going to make is, as a Christian, we do have to believe that change is possible. Obviously, redemption being one of the biggest, principles in Christianity, you do need to believe that that is possible. Now, when it comes to personality, as I kind of said before, that doesn't mean that, being high in agreeableness is good and low is bad, or being high in openness is good and low is bad. That's not necessarily the case. It is perfectly fine wherever you're at. I will say this, I guess the one caveat is there's maybe something to be said about you don't necessarily wish to be high in neuroticism if you can help it, but that is also something that, as with everything else, people are able to work with, and God is able to help you grow in that area of your personality. But when it comes to everything else, the thing I find the most valuable about personality tests is not that it makes me actually feel like I know who I am, but it makes me find what I need to account for. Kind of like I said before. So, as we said with agreeableness, I'm lower in it. So, I feel like actually over the past 5 or 6 years since I really started looking into personality and the big five, I've actually come to be more understanding of people who are higher in agreeableness. Kind of like I said before, I used to look at a lot of people who are high in agreeableness as fake or as just people who valued unity over principle. I used to just basically say, oh, these people don't actually have morals to a certain degree, even though I didn't necessarily go that far. But I used to kind of be like, those people don't actually really have principles they stand by. They just want to get along with everybody, and it makes me sick. That's the most extreme version of how I would have felt. But I have come to understand that there's a real value in unity. And many times for a lot of those people, it's just the fact that the moment in which they're in, they believe that the disagreement is not big enough for them to make a fuss about it, and it is better that people stay together. And there is a real true value in that. Like I said, I'm disagreeable, but obviously sometimes if disagreements go wrong, they can fracture friendships or nations or whatever the case is forever, right? And so you need to be careful with that. And so that has helped me in my marriage. I feel like that's helped me with my perspective now of talking to people that I view as, smiley all the time, and they seem to always just want to kind of keep the status quo. I actually feel like I understand those people a bit more than I used to. And so I find that the personality tests are good for you to understand areas where you actually might have bias towards other people and be more loving and compassionate to those people.
And even in the Bible, I think it does a good job showing us that there are those times where the Holy Spirit can empower you to go beyond whatever confines that you set up. So if you're like, well, I'm an introvert, I don't really talk to people, I don't really do a lot of big group or public speaking type things, but there are times when I think the Holy Spirit can empower you to stand up and preach. And I think sometimes those can be even like bigger witnesses, especially to the people who know you, where it's like, oh, that's not how so-and-so behaves normally. That's really interesting that they seem very comfortable.
Yeah, I can say in my life for sure that I feel like what the Holy Spirit has done for me is the Holy Spirit has given me a compassion for people that I don't feel like I had in the past sometimes. I'm not the type of person who, if somebody talks about the sad things that are going on in their life, that kind of instantly empathizes with people. And I wish that I was, but I'm not. But there have definitely been a lot of times where I have felt as if God has been pushing me through the Holy Spirit to empathize with people, to feel the same things they do, to want to act in some way to help. And so that's one way I can speak to, in which I feel like the Holy Spirit has definitely worked in spite of my personality to a certain degree. Yeah, so I suppose getting back to what you originally asked me about when you asked me why I got into psychology, truth be told, probably the primary motivator for that was because in high school, long story short, it's the time period in which I had essentially decided, like, I need to figure out what Jesus is about and I need to follow Jesus. I had been going through a lot of different depression. I shouldn't say different depression, but I had been going through depression in high school. A lot of that had to do with asking the big questions, like, why am I here? Why does anything matter? I'm just going to die eventually and turn to dust. And in the end of the day, nothing matters. Obviously, very, very nihilistic thoughts that I think unfortunately permeate with a lot of people from our generation and younger, as the suicide rate has gone up, sadly enough. But I was dealing with a lot of those thoughts. And so I did go to church growing up, but I never really got very interested in it, as it was an older type of church and it felt very ritualistic and in no way something that I had any desire for. It felt kind of like I was just there. It's just I just had to go through the motions and do it, and I never felt inspired. I never felt in any way, shape, or form like it was speaking to my soul, you could say. But again, while kind of glossing over some of the details, essentially in my teenage years, I had been dealing with a lot of depression, also dealing with a lot of expectations of, what I wanted for my life, and dealing with not being able to be with a girl that I had really liked at the time, typical teenage boy stuff. And so it did lead me to a point where I seriously contemplated suicide. And there's 2 times in my life where I had really gotten to a point where I was like, yep, tonight's the night. I'm just doing it. And the first night, I stopped and kind of said, well, you know what? I know some friends who go to this other church. I'm going to go check that out. I'm going to go see if there's anything to this at all. Because even if there's a 1% chance, I ought to try it. And I did. And, for a few years after that, it was kind of like, yeah, maybe there is something to this. This church is very different. The friends I had seemed to be talking about Jesus in a way that I'd never heard before. But I still was dealing with a lot of those same issues of depression. And 2 years later, due to certain events that had happened with the girl I liked, then presumably dating my best friend, I had kind of felt betrayed by certain things that had happened. And I was like, all right, well, that's it. Time to go. So that night led me to late at night, just running on a country road in the middle of the night, and just running, kind of lamenting out to God, not sure if God was hearing or even if God existed, but kind of just lamenting about everything I felt like I was going through, about how I felt like the world wasn't fair, about how I felt like there was really no reason to continue on. And a very strange thing occurred where I heard a small audible voice, something that has not happened to me since, but I heard a very small audible voice, in the middle of the road at night in my ear, just saying, run.
Just saying run.
Yes. Yeah, just saying run. And I turned around, and what I saw when I turned around was this 2-legged shadowy figure just chasing me. So I just ran. I just ran home, just ran for a mile. I don't remember thinking about anything. I was just running. I was just terrified and just ran. Eventually got back home, turned around, looked behind me, did not see a thing. And at that point, I remember thinking, okay, I'm crazy. Okay, I've cracked. I'm nuts. Like that's what's happened. Like it's over for me. But I also couldn't stop laughing about it. I just was laughing a lot, and I laughed myself to sleep, essentially. And woke up the next day, and a lot of the feelings that I had of despair, a lot of the feelings that I had about, a lot of the depression that I had seemed to go away. And it's not to say that the thoughts about, some of those questions I had are completely gone and I forgot everything, but a lot of the, I guess I would say, emotionality attached to it just wasn't there as much. And after some time thinking about it, I got to think like maybe there was something happening. Maybe there was something happening there with God saving me from that. The best interpretation I've had of that situation is viewing it almost as like a manifestation of running from some type of, selfish spirit, or you could maybe say demon. But it is a very strange situation. There are a lot of people that you could probably talk to if you talk to Christians who will tell you that they have so many different crazy stories about the supernatural, right? I am not a person who has a lot of stories like that. And so that baffles me and still baffles me in terms of the specifics to this day. But that is one of the things that really led me to wanting to go into psychology as well. Just, trying to find out if I was crazy. But right. I've kind of made a lot of peace with that and what happened, and kind of viewing that as, it seems to me, like I said before, like a physical manifestation of me running from demons that I had. And so I really do believe that God has saved me from a lot of the emotionality that came with the depression that I went through in high school.
That's a great story. Great testimony. And I think it's cool that you seem okay with not being able to fully explain what happened.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I wish I could.
Right.
But I think that there is always going to be the unknowns when it comes to the spiritual. And that just comes from humans being both, spiritual beings, but also being beings of the material world. And I'm okay with that. I am. I feel like I have a good understanding of what that was and what happened in that moment, but I think any person who claims that they understand everything that's happening, in the, quote unquote spiritual realm, I'm very skeptical of.
Cool. And I think that kind of ties back to the broader conversation on psychology, where a lot of times maybe we look to these personality tests or these studies to get a full understanding and be able to explain everything in our life. But there is still that tension between what we can explain and the mystery. And sometimes there's more that we can explain, and sometimes there's a little more mystery. And I think your life, your testimony is a good encapsulation of that tension, and that you can have both, and that's absolutely okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Jared. And thank you all for listening in. We'll catch you next time. Thank you for joining us today. You can support the show by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/story516. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Spotify. We look forward to seeing you next time.